They all turned their backs on me, until his voice cut through the silence. Kaelith's bare feet sank into the cold mud of the clearing as she knelt before her pack, the mocking whispers of her tormentors cutting sharper than claws. Tonight was supposed to seal her fate, cast her out for good. Yet under the pale glow of the moon, a stranger's shadow fell over her. A presence so powerful, it silenced even her father's cruel sneer. She didn't know it then, but her entire life was about to ignite. Kaelith's days were stitched together with humiliation and hunger, an endless cycle that bled into each sunrise like a wound that never healed, her thin frame moving silently through the cold halls of the Shadowmere packhouse as though she were little more than a shadow herself, her breath catching each time she passed another wolf who would sneer, whisper, or shove her aside as if she were filth. And she bore it all with a lowered gaze, knowing that defiance brought only harsher punishment. She had learned this lesson young, beneath the harsh hand of her father, Alpha Corvin, who had deemed her a disgrace from the moment she failed to shift at her first blood moon, his disappointment carved into her skin through countless bruises disguised as training, his contempt poisoning the air of her every waking moment. Yet still she endured, moving quietly through mornings that bit with frost, rising before anyone else to scrub the blood from the training yard stones, to fetch water from the well with raw, blistered palms, to prepare meals she would never taste first, because an Omega who could not shift was no wolf at all in their eyes, and if she was to survive, she had to disappear into silence. Even now, at 18, Kaelith's body remained painfully slight, her ribs sharp against pale skin that carried the pale blue map of old scars, her frame so small that the other wolves mocked her openly, saying she looked like prey rather than predator. And perhaps they were right, though she had long learned that predators often hid behind pretty words and cruelty wore the face of her own bloodline. For even her father, towering and cold as a mountain, did not call her daughter, but the mistake, a name that clung to her like a second skin. She carried herself with the hunched posture of one used to blows, flinching when footsteps echoed behind her, ducking her head when laughter arose around her, her amber eyes dulled to embers after years of ridicule. Yet deep inside, somewhere beneath the layers of shame, a spark still lived, kept alive by fragile memories. Her grandmother Elaris's soft, weathered hands cupping her face, whispering stories of wolves who danced under the moonlight, of bloodlines blessed by starlight, and the soft floral scent that clung to her mother's old den. Wildflowers blooming defiantly even after her mother's mysterious death, their fragrance a ghostly reminder that once someone had loved her enough to fight for her. Kaelith often crept to that den when no one watched, kneeling in the moss where the earth smelled sweet and alive, breathing deeply until the weight pressing on her chest eased just enough to keep her from breaking completely, because the rest of her world was sharp edges and harsh words, her every mistake punished, her every breath a reminder she was alive only because her father had not yet decided killing her would be worth the trouble. And so she learned to move like a whisper, to swallow her pain until it became part of her bones, to find small comforts in the quiet moments before dawn when frost glazed the grass and the pack still slept. Those were her only moments of peace, when the soft orange glow of lantern light spilled from shuttered windows and she could pause in her chores to watch her breath curl like mist into the air. Those fleeting seconds where she pretended she was just a girl, not a burden, not a mistake, not the broken Omega they despised, yet reality always returned swiftly, in the slam of doors and the bark of orders, in the sneering faces of Riven and Cain, the sadistic twins who had tormented her since they were children, their games crueler now, their laughter sharper, often joined by Varric, the pack's enforcer, whose towering presence and cruel smirk made her blood run cold. For he relished every chance to remind her she was nothing, grabbing her by the hair and shoving her face into the dirt during training drills, mocking her inability to shift as though it were a personal insult to him. Her shoulders bore the bruises of his grip even now, the purple-black marks blooming over thin skin. And she bit her lip hard enough to taste blood whenever she bathed, careful not to make a sound because weakness was an invitation to more cruelty, and she could not afford to bleed where they could see. Her only ally was Alaris, her grandmother, whose frail body carried a strength the pack dismissed, her silver hair braided neatly down her back, her sharp, knowing eyes softening only when they rested on Kaelith. And though she spoke little, her presence was a balm in Kaelith's storm of loneliness, her whispered advice to bend, not break, echoing in Kaelith's mind each time she endured another humiliation. Still, even Alaris could not shield her tonight, for tonight was the mating ceremony, an event meant to celebrate alliances between packs, where wolves would flaunt their strength, beauty and status beneath moonlit skies, where she would stand on display like a lamb among wolves, her failure known to all, her shame paraded for the entertainment of nobles who would drink and whisper behind jeweled masks. Her father's scorn sharpened into a weapon as he presented her not as a daughter, but a blemish he could not hide, and the thought made her stomach knot with dread, bile rising as she scrubbed the floors of the great hall until her fingers went numb, her reflection warped in the polished stone, her hair a tangled curtain shielding her face from passing wolves who sneered at her bent posture, her simple dress clinging to her frail frame. Outside, preparations echoed through the cold evening air, servants rushing to hang lanterns, the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine filling the corridors, laughter and footsteps filling the silence she clung to like armor, and she kept her head low, her heart pounding with the knowledge that soon she would stand beneath that grand moon, her humiliation sealed. Her fate as the pack's lowest rung burned into memory. But even as fear coiled tight in her chest, a part of her lingered in that old den, remembering her mother's laughter, the way sunlight once filtered through the leaves, remembering Alaris's stories of wolves who carried the moon's blessing in their blood, a gift and a curse whispered of only in legends. And though she told herself those stories were just that, fairy tales to soothe a frightened child, she could not help but wish, in the deepest part of her heart, that there was something more to her than this life of shadows and shame, that there was a reason she had survived when the world seemed so determined to crush her. But for now, survival was all she knew, and so she moved through the ceremony preparations like a ghost, silent and unseen, the scent of wildflowers lingering faintly in her memory, the only trace of warmth in a world that had long since turned its back on her. The grand hall glimmered under a canopy of lanterns that swayed gently with the draught drifting through its high archways, their golden light spilling across polished stone floors, and banners of deep crimson embroidered with the sigils of powerful packs, the Shadowmere crest looming proudly at the centre, though Kaelith felt no pride as she stood against the far wall, half hidden behind a column, clutching the folds of her plain dress like a lifeline, while wolves in finery glided past her with the easy grace of predators at home in their domain, their laughter a soft hum beneath the tension that hung thick in the air. For all of them knew tonight was different. Tonight, the Alpha King himself was coming, a man whose very name sent tremors through rival packs, A shadow whispered of in fearful tones around crackling fires, a ruler whose ruthlessness had built an empire and crushed entire, a bloodlines that defied him. And even here, in her father's stronghold, Kaelith could feel the shift in energy, the way wolves straightened their spines and smoothed their garments, voices lowering. In reverence, their arrogance muted by anticipation, and though she was used to being invisible, tonight she felt smaller than ever, her presence like an unwanted blemish against the splendor of the gathering. She kept her eyes down, heart pounding as she wove through the bustling servants carrying trays of food that glistened with rich gravies, the scent of roasted venison and spiced wine filling the air. Her stomach twisting painfully as her gaze flickered toward the towering double doors at the end of the hall, the ones all eyes seemed fixed upon, for behind them waited the man who ruled over them all. Whispers rose like smoke, curling around her ears. Tales she had heard her entire life, but had never believed she'd hear spoken in the flesh. Stories of a man who had taken the throne drenched in blood, whose wolf was said to be a creature of nightmares, whose golden eyes could strip a man of courage with a single glance. And Kaelith's pulse quickened, not from excitement, but from the instinctive fear that coiled tighter in her chest with every heartbeat. She tried to focus on her tasks, on keeping herself small and unnoticed, but even the air seemed charged, heavy with an electric tension that pressed against her skin, and every whisper she overheard only sharpened her unease. Her packmates' voices tinged with awe and dread. "Draven Veylock. They say he broke Alpha Seren's spine in one strike. They say he hasn't taken a mate because no one is worthy. They say he can smell weakness like blood in water." Kaelith swallowed hard, her throat dry, and tucked herself further into the shadows of a pillar, trying to become invisible as the murmurs rose to a sudden hush. A silence so complete it sent a chill crawling up her spine, and then the doors opened. The lantern light caught on blackened steel, on a figure framed by the night beyond the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered. His presence filling the hall before he even stepped across the threshold, the kind of presence that seemed to bend the very air around him, and Kaelith felt her breath catch as her gaze flickered up despite herself, drawn as if by instinct to the man who entered with the quiet grace of a predator, his armor dark and gleaming, his cloak trailing like spilled ink across the polished floor, his hair as black as a raven's wing, his golden eyes glinting beneath the shadows of the hall. Draven Veylock, the Alpha King, moved with a lethal calm, his every step measured, each movement radiating restrained power that made even the boldest alphas flanking the dais stiffen in respect. And Kaelith felt the weight of him before his gaze even swept the crowd, her heart pounding so hard she thought the wolves closest to her could hear it. She ducked her head, hoping his attention would slide past her like every other wolf in this hall, hoping she could remain nothing more than a shadow against the wall. But curiosity tugged at her, and she risked a glance, a fleeting look that collided with his gaze, golden, sharp, and unyielding, and the world seemed to still, every sound muffled beneath the rush of her pulse in her ears as his eyes locked on hers, just for a second that felt stretched and endless, a second in which she swore he saw straight through her plain dress, her hunched posture, her trembling hands, stripping her down to something raw and undefended. And for that second, she could not move, could not breathe, her fingers clutching the fabric at her side so tightly her knuckles ached. And then, as swiftly as it had come, his attention shifted, gliding over the rest of the pack with that same piercing weight, leaving her shaken, her body buzzing with the strange awareness that his glance had not been a passing one. She pressed herself harder against the coal. Cheeks burning, as if the entire hall had seen what had just passed between them, though no one looked her way, all eyes fixed on the imposing figure now making his way toward the dais, his beater. A tall man with steel-grey eyes and a scar slicing across his jaw, flanking him with military precision, their presence casting a hush over the gathered alphas and betas, who bowed their heads in submission. Kaelith's breath trembled as she shrank further back, watching as her father stepped forward, his posture rigid but his tone smooth as he welcomed the king with a voice that carried forced confidence. Yet even Corvin Duskbane, feared alpha of Shadowmere, seemed smaller standing before Draven, whose golden gaze swept the hall like a blade, assessing, measuring, commanding silence without a word. Kaelith's pulse hammered in her throat as she dared to look at him again, captivated despite her fear by the aura of absolute dominance that clung to him like a second skin. A presence so sharp it seemed to slice through the thick scent of perfume and roasted meats that hung in the air, and she felt her breath hitch when his gaze briefly returned to her corner, lingering for the barest heartbeat before moving on, leaving her frozen in place, unsure if she had imagined it, her body tingling as though struck by lightning, the faintest tremor running through her hands as she clenched them into fists to still the shaking. The room was alive with tension, wolves shifting uncomfortably under the king's silent scrutiny, and Kaelith forced herself to lower her eyes, pretending to focus on the polished floor beneath her feet, her mind racing with questions she dared not voice, her fear interwoven with something she couldn't name, a strange weight in her chest that made her stomach knot tighter with every moment that passed, because she had never seen a man like him, never felt a presence like his, and though she told herself it meant nothing, that he hadn't truly seen her, a quiet voice deep within whispered otherwise, leaving her trembling in the shadow of a man who ruled them all. The hall's vibrant hum of music and laughter felt like a razor's edge against Kaelith's skin as she stood frozen near the edge of the polished floor, her body stiff from hours of trying to appear invisible. Yet even in her silence she had become a target. The sharp, taunting voice of Riven sliced through the din, his words dripping with venom as he stalked around her like a predator toying with its kill, his tall frame casting a shadow over her as he tilted his head with a cruel grin, his sharp canines flashing in amusement, while Cain leaned lazily against a nearby column, his smirk mirroring his twins, the scent of arrogance and cheap cologne clinging to him, their shared cruelty, an old dance she had endured for years but never gotten used to. "Still can't shift," Riven murmured loudly, making sure nearby guests heard, his voice carrying easily over the soft melodies of flutes and the tinkling of wine glasses, and Kaelith's cheeks burned under the weight of curious glances flicking her way, the heat of embarrassment crawling up her neck as Cain chuckled low, the sound sharp and mocking, like claws scraping against stone. Varric, towering and broad-shouldered, loomed over her with a grin that didn't reach his cold eyes, his hand gripping her shoulder with enough force to make her wince as he shoved her forward, making her stumble into the center of a patch of lantern light, her plain dress catching the glow and drawing even more attention to her unwanted presence. Whispers rippled through the gathered wolves like a current, some murmuring with pity, others with open disdain, and Kaelith's stomach twisted as the familiar sting of humiliation seared through her chest, her fingers curling tightly into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms as she fought to hold herself still, her breath trembling in her throat. Riven stepped closer, lowering his voice enough that only she and his twin could hear, his words meant to slice deeper than claws. "Maybe they'll finally put you down tonight, Omega. Maybe they'll stop pretending you're worth feeding, Cain." snickered softly, sipping his drink as though this was all a show staged for his amusement, his eyes glinting with malice as Varric's grip on her shoulder tightened, a silent warning that resistance would only make things worse. Kaelith kept her gaze lowered, her lashes casting shadows over her amber eyes, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break, though her chest ached with the effort of holding back tears, her breathing shallow and unsteady as the music swelled around her, a cruel contrast to the venomous words whispered in her ear. The scent of roasted meats and wine felt suffocating now, mingling with the musk of wolves pressed close together, their gazes like daggers in her back, and she wished desperately she could melt into the floor, vanish into shadow, become the ghost they already treated her as. But the laughter around her felt deafening, each chuckle another reminder that she was the evening's entertainment. Riven circled her again, his boots clicking softly on the polished stone, a predator savouring his cruelty, and Kane's voice joined in, casual and cruel. "Don't look so scared, runt. Maybe someone will pity you enough to take you in, though I wouldn't hold my breath." Their words twisted like knives, digging into old wounds carved deep from years of ridicule, and Kaelith's fingers trembled as she clenched them tighter, willing herself not to cry, not to give them the pleasure of seeing her crumble, her jaw tightening as she tried to steady her breathing. But Varric's sudden shove nearly sent her to her knees, and she bit her lip hard enough to taste blood, the copper tang grounding her as her body trembled from the humiliation. She dared a glance upward, only to catch the flicker of movement near the dais where the Alpha King stood, his golden eyes sweeping the crowd like sunlight cutting through a storm, and for a breathless second, those piercing eyes found her again. The world seemed to still as Draven's gaze lingered, sharp and unyielding, his expression unreadable, yet heavy with a power that made the wolves around him stiffen instinctively. Varric's mocking smile faltered when he realized where the king's attention had landed, and a strange tension rippled through the air, the laughter around them faltering as though some primal instinct warned them they were being watched by something far more dangerous than their petty games. Kaelith's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break through her chest, her breath catching as she stood frozen under that golden gaze, every muscle in her body taut, every nerve alight with awareness. And though Draven said nothing, did nothing, the weight of his stare was enough to make Varric's smirk slip further, a flicker of unease breaking through his bravado. Kane cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably, his mocking grin faltering as though he could feel the Alpha King's silent scrutiny. And Riven hesitated for just a moment before stepping back, his sneer faltering under the invisible pressure of that gaze. Kaelith's pulse raced, her mind spinning as she tried to process what was happening, unsure why the king's attention would linger on her of all people. Yet she felt the weight of it like a physical thing, pressing against her skin, filling her with a strange mix of fear and something else she couldn't name. Draven's expression remained unreadable, but there was something sharp in his eyes, something protective that made her chest tighten in confusion, and for a fleeting second she thought she saw the faintest flicker of warning in his gaze, a silent promise that sent a shiver racing down her spine. Varric shifted his stance, his posture stiffening, his grip on her shoulder loosening as though he sensed he had overstepped, and the hall seemed to hold, its breath, the tension thick enough to choke on. Yet no one spoke, the music playing on as if nothing had happened, the laughter slowly returning in hushed tones, though it carried a different edge. Now, a cautious undertone as Draven's golden eyes finally shifted away, his gaze moving elsewhere, leaving behind a silence that buzzed with unspoken threat. Kaelith's body remained rigid, her breath uneven, her mind a blur of confusion and fear as Varric released her, his jaw tight as he stepped back, muttering something under his breath she couldn't catch, while Riven and Cain exchanged uncertain glances, their cruel amusement dimmed for now. She dared not move, dared not speak, her heart still hammering from the intensity of that stare, and though no words had been spoken, she felt as though something in the air had shifted, an invisible boundary drawn between her tormentors and herself. One they were reluctant to cross again, at least for tonight, though she knew well enough their cruelty would not vanish so easily. Still, for the first time in years, she felt a strange flicker of safety, small and fragile, but there nonetheless, sparked by nothing more than the silent, lingering gaze of a man whose very presence demanded obedience. And though Kaelith did not understand it, did not dare hope for anything more, that flicker of safety was enough to steady her trembling hands as she stepped back into the shadow of the column, her breath slow and uneven, her body still shaking, but her spirit holding on just a little tighter. Draven's voice cut through the air like a blade of midnight, deep and measured, a single word that carried the weight of a kingdom, and Kaelith's breath hitched as every muscle in her body locked beneath his commanding presence. The Alpha King's towering frame casting her in shadow, as though the light itself dared not touch him. And for a heartbeat, the crowded hall seemed to shrink to just the two of them, a trembling Omega staring up at the man who could crush armies, yet stood silent before her, his sharp gaze burning into her like fire seeking. Secrets buried deep in her bones, and the music that had been weaving through the ceremony faltered, as if the minstrels too were held captive by his sudden stillness, and Kaelith felt the weight of countless eyes pressing into her skin, the judgment of the pack, the curiosity of strangers, the thrill of fear rippling through the room. But none of it mattered, because his eyes, those dark, predatory eyes, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and untouchable, as though he had found something worth killing for, or perhaps something worth saving. And her heart thundered wildly in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears like war drums, her instincts screaming at her to bow her head and submit. Yet some stubborn spark inside her refused to cower, refused to give him anything but the shaky breath she forced through her trembling lips, and in that breath she caught his scent, wild and unrelenting like a forest at night after a storm, layered with power and danger and something ancient that made her knees threaten to give way. Yet she stood frozen in place, her fingers curling at her sides as his gaze travelled over her as though memorizing her, and the silence stretched so taut it was almost unbearable. The laughter and mockery of moments ago swallowed whole by the thick tension that now coiled through the hall, until finally his lips parted, his words a low command, barely audible, but laced with a promise that sent a shiver racing down her spine. "Be ready," he murmured, his voice only for her, intimate in its softness yet heavy with authority. And before she could even comprehend what she was meant to be ready for, he stepped past her, his cloak brushing against her bare arm, the faintest touch that ignited her nerves like fire, and she stood there trembling as he walked away with the same quiet dominance with which he'd arrived, his presence par excellence. Ting the crowd like a predator moving through prey, and Kaelith felt every stare in the room shift back to her, whispers swelling in the wake of his departure, 1,000 interpretations twisting through the air. But she couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly. Her heart caught somewhere between terror and something she didn't dare name, her body betraying her with the warmth blooming in her chest, even as fear kept her rooted to the spot. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't just invisible or pitied or despised. She was noticed, not as a broken Omega, but as someone who had drawn the attention of the Alpha King himself. And that thought both terrified and exhilarated her, her mind spinning with confusion. her pulse loud in her ears as she forced herself to steady her shaking hands, to swallow the lump forming in her throat, her gaze flickering toward the path he had taken, though she quickly dropped her eyes before anyone could see her looking, because she already felt the weight of the pack's judgment like a physical thing pressing down on her shoulders, and she could sense the anger simmering from the enforcers, the disbelief from the twins, the sharp edge of fear from the pack's females who had spent months preparing themselves for a chance to impress their king. And yet he had paused for her, spoken to her, left her trembling and breathless in front of them all, and the realization settled in her chest like a secret she didn't know how to hold, her stomach twisting as she shifted her weight and tried to gather her thoughts. But every detail of that moment clung to her senses, the way his shadow had swallowed her, the way his voice had curled around her name without ever speaking it, the way his scent had made her wolf stir within her chest for the first time in what felt like years, a restless pulse of energy that left her shaky and overwhelmed, and she wrapped her arms around herself, wishing desperately for her grandmother's calm voice to guide her, for anyone to explain what had just happened. But there were no answers here, only the low hum of conversation rising again around her, the crowd pretending to return to their festivities though their glances kept darting her way, curiosity and malice mixing like poison in the air, and Kaelith felt like she was standing on a precipice, some invisible line she'd just crossed without meaning to, her world tilting dangerously, her instincts screaming at her that nothing would ever be the same, and still she stood frozen, her breaths shallow, her heart refusing to slow as his words echoed again and again in her head. Be ready. 2 simple words that felt like both a warning and a promise, both a threat and an invitation. And though she didn't know why, didn't know what storm she had just been pulled into, she felt it in her bones, in the restless stirrings of her wolf, in the electric crackle that still clung to the air around her. Something had shifted, something monumental, and she was no longer just the pack's broken omega, though whether that made her safer or sealed her doom, she couldn't yet tell. And as she finally forced herself to move, to slip quietly toward the back of the hall, away from prying eyes and sharp whispers, her mind raced, replaying every second of his piercing gaze, every syllable of his low command. And she wrapped her arms tighter around herself, as if she could hold in the storm now raging within her, her trembling hands betraying the truth she was too afraid to admit. She wasn't just scared, she was awake. Kaelith slipped through the edges of the bustling hall like a shadow, her steps light, careful, her back brushing against cold stone walls as she tried to disappear. But every nerve in her body was alive, every sound amplified. The clinking of goblets, the murmured gossip, the sharp laughter of pack members who had spent years mocking her, and now their whispers followed her like a trail of daggers, each one digging deeper, though none of compared to the heavy imprint of his gaze that still lingered on her skin, leaving her flushed and trembling, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths as she pushed herself toward the quieter edges of the ceremony, where torchlight flickered softer and the air smelled faintly of pine smoke rather than perfume and wine. And for a moment she leaned against a pillar, pressing a hand over her thundering heart, wishing she could scrape away the feeling that his voice had carved into her soul. 2 words that echoed like a prophecy she couldn't escape, and yet she couldn't stop replaying them, couldn't stop imagining that intensity in his eyes, that quiet, commanding power. And she hated herself for it, because he was danger embodied, the kind of man who could break her without effort. Yet he had looked at her like she was something rare, something worth seeing, And that frightened her more than anything, more than the sneers of Riven and Kain, who were now slinking through the crowd with predatory smirks, their golden eyes scanning for her, hungry for a new way to humiliate her after being silenced by the king's mere glance. And she ducked back into the shadows, moving past the tables laden with food she would never be allowed to touch, her stomach aching with hunger she'd long since learned to ignore, and her steps quickened as she slipped down a narrow hallway leading to the outer corridors, the air cooler there, quieter, save for the distant hum of music and laughter echoing through stone halls. And she closed her eyes for a heartbeat, inhaling deeply, trying to steady herself, but the scent of pine and rain still lingered faintly in her senses. His scent. And she cursed softly under her breath, shoving the thought away, knowing she couldn't afford distraction. Not here, not tonight, when any wrong step could lead to punishment. And as she rounded a corner, her breath caught at the sight of Varric leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his imposing figure blocking her path like a predator waiting for prey, his smirk sharp and dangerous. "Going somewhere, little emus," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery, and Kaelith froze, every instinct screaming to turn and flee. But before she could, Riven and Kain appeared behind her, their identical smirks twisted with malice, trapping her between them, and she realized too late she had walked straight into their trap, her pulse skyrocketing as Varric pushed off the wall, towering over her, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement as he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch making her flinch, which only deepened his smirk. "You think you can hide from us? After what you did, embarrassing us in front of the king like that," he hissed, and Kaelith's breath hitched, her mind racing, knowing that saying anything would only feed their cruelty. So she stayed silent, jaw clenched, fists curled at her sides. Though her trembling betrayed her, and Riven chuckled darkly, circling her like a wolf toying with its prey. "Look at her, shaking like a leaf," he murmured, while Kain leaned closer from behind, whispering into her ear. "The king's little pet, is that it? Think he's going to save you, Omega?" And Kaelith swallowed hard, fighting to keep her expression blank, though her body was rigid with fear, the three of them hemming her in, their presence suffocating, the narrow hallway closing in around her as Varric grabbed her wrist suddenly, his grip like iron, dragging her closer, and she bit back a cry, glaring up at him through the fear because showing weakness would only make it worse. But he only grinned, a predator enjoying the game, leaning in so close she could smell the acrid tang of alcohol on his breath as he growled, "You think you're special now. You're nothing. Just a broken wolf who can't even shift." And the words hit their mark. But Kaelith refused to let him see it, her nails digging into her palms as she steadied herself, meeting his gaze with fiancé she didn't feel, which seemed to amuse him further, because he released her wrist, only to shove her back against the cold stone wall, the impact jolting through her bones, and she bit down on Erd, her lip hard enough to taste blood, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a sound, and the twins laughed softly, their amusement at her pain cutting deeper than the physical blow. But then Varric's laughter faltered, his nostrils flaring, and Kaelith saw his eyes flicker briefly toward the shadows at the far end of the corridor, his smirk wavering just for a heartbeat. And though she didn't dare glance that way, her instincts prickled, her wolf stirring uneasily inside her, sensing something powerful watching, and Varric stiffened slightly before forcing his smirk back into place, leaning in closer as if to reassert dominance, though his voice carried a sharp edge now. "You'll regret making me look like a fool," he muttered, and with one final shove that sent her stumbling to her knees, he and the twins retreated, their laughter echoing down the hall as they disappeared around the corner. And Kaelith stayed frozen there for a moment, on her knees, shaking with both fear and fury. her chest heaving as she pressed a trembling hand to the cold wall for support. And though her body ached, though humiliation burned hot in her cheeks, she clenched her jaw, refusing to cry, forcing herself to stand even as her knees trembled. And when she finally dared to glance down the shadowed corridor where Varick's gaze had flicked, she swore she saw movement, a ripple of darkness and light, like a predator lurking just out of sight. And though she couldn't see him, couldn't hear him, the air was thick with an unseen presence that made her skin prickle. A power so heavy it pressed against her chest, and her breath hitched as she realized he was there, watching, silent, unseen. And though terror should have consumed her, some strange, inexplicable calm settled over her instead, a reassurance that she wasn't entirely alone. And for the first time in years, Kaelith felt something other than fear or shame. She felt a flicker of safety, small and fragile, but real, and she clung to it as she straightened her spine, wiped the dirt from her knees, and forced herself to walk back toward the hall, her head low, but her heart pounding with a strange, restless energy she couldn't name. Every step echoing with the haunting certainty that someone had been there in the shadows, watching, guarding, waiting. Varick's grip on her arm was iron, his claws digging deep as he dragged her farther from the glowing lanterns of the ceremonial grounds, the sounds of laughter and music fading until only the whisper of wind through dead leaves surrounded them. Kaelith stumbled over roots, breath ragged, the cold night air biting her skin as fear coiled tight in her chest, every instinct screaming that she would not leave these woods alive tonight. And yet no one came to stop him, not even the man who had given her life, her father, whose gaze burned with shame rather than mercy as he allowed his enforcer to drag her like prey, his silence louder than any condemnation. "You don't belong here," Varick growled again, his voice low and venomous, each word dripping with cruelty as he shoved her hard against a tree, bark scraping her back through her thin dress, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst. His golden eyes gleamed with savage delight, the hunger for blood clear in every sharp movement, every flex of his clawed hand as he raised it high, ready to strike. Kaelith's lips trembled, but no sound escaped, no plea, no scream, because she knew it would only feed his satisfaction. And the mocking laughter of Riven and Cain filled the clearing, twin echoes of malice that danced like shadows around her, their voices overlapping in cruel harmony as they taunted, "Maybe it's better this way, at least she won't embarrass us anymore," and "Poor little broken thing, all one in the dark." Their words cut sharper than Varick's claws, but nothing hurt more than the silent figure standing just behind them, her father's broad shoulders outlined against the silver wash of moonlight, his eyes cold and hard as stone, offering no rescue, no comfort, nothing but confirmation that she was worthless in his eyes, that he would rather see her blood spill on the forest floor than admit she was his daughter. Pain erupted as Varick's claws finally tore into her shoulder, a searing slash that ripped through flesh and fabric alike, hot blood soaking down her arm as a choked gasp escaped her throat, and her knees buckled beneath her, the world tilting violently as agony surged through every nerve, her vision blurring until the forest seemed to spin, colours bleeding together into a haze of black and red. She could hear the twins laughing still, but their voices seemed distant now, muffled as though underwater. And even Varick's heavy breathing became a dull roar in her ears. She tasted iron on her tongue, the metallic tang of her own blood, and the cold bite of dirt and moss beneath her palms as she struggled to stay upright. Every breath was a battle, shallow and uneven, and panic clawed at her chest. But beneath the fear, There was a strange flicker of defiance, a whisper in her heart that refused to let go, even as darkness crowded the edges of her sight. Another blow came, sharp and jarring, as Varric's claws struck again, this time raking down her arm, forcing a cry from her lips, and her head snapped back, vision flashing white with pain. She heard one of the twins mockingly clap, their voices slithering closer as they circled her like vultures waiting for a kill. "What's the matter, little Omega?" Cain sneered, his voice like silk-wrapped poison. "No one coming to save you?" His words twisted deep into her chest, because she knew he was right. No one would come, not her father, not the pack, not anyone. She was alone. But then, cutting through the cruel laughter and taunting voices, came a sound that froze every wolf in that clearing. A howl, low and powerful, rolling through the night air like thunder breaking over a battlefield. It wasn't the voice of any wolf she recognized, not one from Shadowmere or its neighboring packs. This howl was deeper, richer, filled with something primal and commanding that made even Varric falter, his claws hesitating mid-strike as his head snapped up toward the sound. The twins fell silent, their smirks fading as unease rippled through them, and Kaelith, half-conscious and slumped against the tree, felt a shiver run down her spine. Not of fear, but something else, something ancient and instinctive, a pull that resonated deep in her bones. Her breath hitched, ragged and shallow, as the howl echoed again, closer this time, vibrating through the ground beneath her trembling body, a sound that demanded submission from every wolf who heard it. Varric cursed under his breath, the first trace of fear flickering in his eyes, and even her father's stoic mask cracked slightly, a shadow of doubt crossing his face as he glanced toward the dark tree line from where the sound had come. Kaelith blinked through the blur of pain and blood, her mind struggling to stay awake, to comprehend what was happening, but every instinct she had screamed that this was no ordinary wolf, no pack enforcer, no wandering predator. It was something else, something greater, and the air itself seemed to thicken with its presence, the scent of power curling through the cold night breeze. Her heart pounded unevenly as the distant rustle of branches reached her ears, slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey, and Varric's growl of irritation betrayed the unease gnawing at him. "Stay sharp!" he barked at the twins, his voice lower now, tighter, though he tried to mask it with arrogance. But Kaelith could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his claws flexed nervously, and even through her haze of power. And she felt a strange satisfaction. He was afraid. She forced her eyes open wider, fighting the pull of unconsciousness as the shadows between the trees seemed to shift, shapes moving within them. And then silence fell, heavy and suffocating, as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something monumental to happen. The clearing was bathed in silver light from the full moon overhead, but it suddenly felt darker, as if night itself had deepened, wrapping them all in its cold embrace. Kaelith's pulse thundered in her ears as her gaze darted toward the tree line, heart aching with a strange mixture of dread and desperate hope, though she didn't know why. She only knew that something was coming, something unstoppable. Varric snarled, stepping closer to her, his body tense like a coiled spring, claws still dripping with her blood, but even his bravado faltered as another sound joined the silence, the low, rumbling growl of a predator, so deep it vibrated through the earth, a sound that sent every instinct screaming at them to submit or run. The twins exchanged nervous glances, and Kaelith's father stiffened, his jaw tightening as though he'd just realized the gravity of the situation. Kaelith's body trembled violently, her breath shallow, but she couldn't look away from the darkness beneath the trees, where glowing eyes, bright, molten gold, slowly emerged from the shadows, piercing through the gloom like twin suns. Draven arrived like a storm, the forest itself seeming to recoil from the force of his presence, his massive frame cutting through the moonlight like a shadow made flesh. And in one devastating motion, his clawed hand struck Varric across the clearing, sending the enforcer crashing into a tree with a bone-rattling thud that silenced even the cruel laughter of the twins. His snarl reverberated like rolling thunder, thick with a fury that sent birds shrieking from their roosts, and every wolf present felt their hackles rise under the sheer weight of his dominance, their instincts screaming at them to bow. "She is mine," his voice cut through. The night, low and lethal, each syllable carrying the kind of authority that left no room for doubt or challenge. And the moment those words fell, an unnatural stillness gripped the pack, their defiance melting into wide-eyed shock, for this was no casual claim. It was a command carved into the marrow of every wolf present. Kaelith's bloodied form trembled where she knelt, her breath shallow, and the coppery scent of her wounds mingled with the Alpha King's intoxicating power, wrapping around her like a shield as gasps rippled through the gathered wolves, disbelief rippling through them like a cold wind, because no one, not even an Omega, had ever been claimed so publicly by Draven Veylock, the king they feared and worshipped. Silence stretched so thick it felt suffocating, every wolf frozen in place, as though the forest itself awaited his next move. Varric groaned where he had fallen, struggling to rise, but one flick of Draven's golden predatory eyes had him pressing his face into the dirt in submission, his body trembling under the crushing weight of the king's aura, which pulsed like a storm ready to strike again. Kaelith's heart thundered painfully in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as she felt his shadow fall over her, his hand reaching down, not rough or commanding, but steady, grounding, and so unexpectedly gentle it sent a shiver down her spine. As he lifted her effortlessly from the ground, his arms wrapping around her slight frame with an ease that spoke of absolute possession and protection. Her head lolled against his chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat cutting through the chaos of her fear, and for the first time in her life she felt safe, even as blood trickled down her arm and the whispers of stunned wolves slithered through the darkness like a tide she could not see but could feel crushing down on her. His scent was intoxicating, a rich blend of cedar, smoke, and something ancient that curled around her senses, drowning out the metallic tang of her own blood and the acrid stench of fear. And though she trembled uncontrollably, her fists curled weakly into the fabric of his shirt, clinging as if letting go would mean falling back into the nightmare she had been dragged through moments before. The twins, who had mocked and hunted her with sadistic glee, stood frozen now, pale-faced and wide-eyed, their arrogance shattered by the brutal reality of Draven's wrath. Their usual smirks were replaced with horror as his gaze flicked toward them, an unspoken warning that promised death should they so much as breathe too loudly in his presence. Every wolf bowed their head instinctively, even Alpha Corvin, Kaelith's own father, whose face had gone ashen at the public humiliation of being powerless before the king. His lips parted as though to speak, to protest, but the words died unspoken as Draven's deep growl reverberated through the clearing, a sound that made even the crickets fall silent. The air seemed to thicken around them, charged with dominance and something far more primal, something that sent Kaelith's wolf, weak and trapped within her, whimpering low in submission, though her human heart beat faster with confusion, fear, and a flicker of awe she couldn't suppress. His hold on her was firm but careful, as if he feared she would shatter under his touch, and when he shifted slightly to shield her from the stares of the pack, she caught a glimpse of his profile, sharp and unyielding, his jaw tight with barely restrained fury, his eyes glowing faintly gold in the dark, their fire burning not just with anger, but with something else, something that softened for a brief moment when they flicked down to her bruised face. "No one touches what is mine," he said, softer now but with a deadly edge, and the words sent a tremor through the wolves around him, their ears flattening, tails low as they dared not meet his gaze. Even Varric, prideful and brutal, stayed prostrated in the dirt, whimpering softly under the weight of his shame. Kaelith's lips parted, but no sound came. Her throat was raw, choked with pain and disbelief, her mind spinning as she struggled to process what was happening, how the most feared alpha in existence now held her like something precious, how he had stood between her and death without hesitation. The cool night air brushed against her sweat-damp skin, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain, and yet all she could focus on was him, his warmth, his scent, the steady rumble of his growl vibrating through his chest as he turned to leave the clearing, his steps slow and measured, radiating a calm so sharp it was more terrifying than his rage. Wolves instinctively parted for him, creating a path through the woods, their heads bowed so low their muzzles nearly touched the dirt. Not a single soul dared speak, though the weight of their shock was palpable, heavy in the air as they watched their ruthless king carry away the Omega they had tormented and discarded for years. Kaelith's vision swam, exhaustion tugging at her like a relentless tide, but she clung to consciousness, her gaze flicking weakly upward to meet his, and in that moment she saw it, a glimmer of something hidden behind his terrifying exterior, something that felt like recognition, as though he had found something he'd been searching for all his life. The thought was dizzying, overwhelming, and before she could question it, before she could even breathe his name, darkness threatened to claim her, her head falling against his chest as his scent wrapped around her like a cocoon, blotting out fear, pain, and the gasps of the pack behind them. Yet even in the haze, one truth cut through her fog. Nothing would ever be the same again. Not after this night, not after his claim. And though her body was weak and battered, her heart pounded with something she couldn't name. Something that terrified, and thrilled her as he carried her away from everything she had ever known. Draven carried Kaelith through the shadowed forest, each deliberate step echoing with a promise of retribution. His arms steady beneath her weight, as if she were nothing, as if the blood soaking through her torn dress and dripping from her shoulder was insignificant compared to the rage burning in his golden eyes. And though her body trembled against him, her mind swirled in a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. She could feel his heartbeat thundering beneath her cheek, strong and steady, a rhythm that seemed to tether her fraying consciousness to him alone. The pack trailed behind at a fearful distance, silent as ghosts, no one daring to question his claim, no one bold enough to meet his gaze. And when they emerged from the dense woods into the courtyard of Shadowmere's ancient stronghold, the torches flickered as if bowing to his presence, their flames dancing wildly in the cold wind that carried the faint scent of coming rain, a smell that mingled with Kaelith's blood and fear, yet somehow felt cleansing. Draven did not speak as he pushed through the towering gates, his aura so thick it seemed to choke the very air, and the guards, hardened warriors who feared nothing, bowed deeply as he passed, their heads lowered, their breaths held, for they had never seen him carry anyone, let alone cradle them as though they were priceless. Inside the dimly lit halls, The air was warmer, filled with the earthy scent of burning cedar and crushed herbs, and Kaelith's vision blurred as the flickering glow of sconces streaked across her dazed gaze. She tried to form words, to ask why he had saved her, to demand an explanation for the possessiveness in his declaration, but her lips trembled and no sound came out, her throat raw with pain and swallowed sobs, and instead she clung tighter to him, her fingers curling weakly into the thick leather of his armor, a silent plea that only seemed to make his jaw tighten with restrained emotion. He carried her up a sweeping staircase, his steps slow and purposeful, the silence between them heavy, yet not oppressive. And when he reached a grand chamber, his private quarters, cloaked in shadow and lit only by a roaring fire, he laid her gently on a massive bed draped in dark furs, the soft texture shocking against her battered body, his hands lingering at her sides for a fraction of a second as though reluctant to let her go. His golden eyes scanned her face, drinking in every bruise, every tear-streaked mark, and something dangerous and possessive glimmered there, a storm held back only by his control. "Stay awake," he commanded softly, his voice deep and smooth, yet edged with worry that surprised her, and as he knelt beside the bed, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as they brushed a lock of blood-matted hair from her face, Kaelith's heart stuttered at the contrast. This was the Alpha King, the monster they whispered about, yet his touch was so careful it made tears well in her eyes. He barked an order, and a healer rushed in, a small, trembling woman carrying salves and cloth, bowing so low her forehead nearly touched the floor, and Draven's glare pinned her in place as he growled, "If she feels even a flicker of pain, you will answer to me." The healer's hands shook as she worked, dabbing Kaelith's wounds with herbs that burned faintly. But every time Kaelith flinched, Draven's growl rumbled low in his chest, a warning to all but her. And despite the pain, Kaelith felt oddly safe, as though nothing, not even death, could touch her while he stood guard. As the healer finished and fled, Draven remained, kneeling beside her bed, one hand resting gently on her hip, as if to ground her, and his gaze softened just slightly, enough for her breath to hitch. "You should hate me," she whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling, because every story she'd heard of him painted him as ruthless, merciless, a beast wrapped in human skin, yet here he was kneeling before her like a knight guarding his queen. He tilted his head, his golden eyes gleaming like molten metal in the firelight, and for a heartbeat, silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. "You are mine," he said simply, not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty, like a vow carved into stone, and Kaelith's pulse stuttered violently, her wolf stirring deep inside her, responding to the power of his claim in a way she couldn't fight. She wanted to protest, to demand why, but his hand rose to her face, his fingers brushing her cheek so lightly it sent a shiver down her spine. And when she met his gaze, she felt the faintest tug of something ancient and fated, a bond thrumming between them like a silent song she hadn't realized she'd been waiting her whole life to hear. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear, as he murmured, "Rest, little wolf. No one will harm you again." The words, soft and unyielding, broke something inside her, and she finally let the tears fall, silent sobs shaking her fragile frame as he gathered her against his chest once more, rocking her gently, his massive form curled protectively around her, as though shielding her from the world itself. Outside, the wind howled through the towers, carrying with it the scent of fear from the wolves who had watched him claim her. But in that room, there was only the sound of her ragged breaths and his low, soothing rumble. Hours passed in silence, and though she tried to stay awake as he had commanded, Exhaustion finally dragged her into darkness, but even as sleep claimed her, she felt his warmth, his scent wrapping around her like a cocoon. And for the first time in her life, her dreams were not filled with fear, but with the golden fire of his eyes and the safety of his arms. When she stirred again, the fire was still crackling, and he was still there, seated beside her bed, his posture alert yet oddly calm, his gaze fixed. On her as though he'd been watching her breathe the entire night. There was a softness in his expression now, so subtle she thought she imagined it. But when he spoke, his voice was steady, resolute. "They will never touch you again. Anyone who tries will not live to see another dawn." His words sent a shiver down her spine, not from fear, but from the intensity of his vow, and something inside her, something wounded and buried deep, began to heal in that moment, fed by his unyielding presence. She opened her mouth to speak, but he silenced her gently, pressing a single finger to her lips, his eyes holding hers with a warmth she hadn't thought him capable of. "Sleep," he whispered, his tone softer than she'd ever imagined. And as her eyes fluttered shut once more, she realized that this was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something far greater, a future forged in blood and fate, with a king who had chosen her, an Omega no one had wanted, and now she belonged to him, not as a possession, but as his equal, his mate, his heart. And as the first rays of dawn pierced through the window, bathing them both in gold, the world outside shifted, for every wolf in Shadowmere would wake knowing their king had found his mate, and nothing would ever be the same.